Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Crime Centric. This being a show where I talk about crime dramas that I watch. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Bull. A very interesting case this episode. Basically, a heroin dealer named Joseph Lowell was killed, and his son ended up, sadly, seeing the murder. But it turns out the DNA underneath the guy's Joseph's fingernails, leads to a Dr. Michael Harper, and it's a 100% match. But Dr. Harper has an alibi. He was with his wife and kids that night. Plus, the fact of the matter is, it's like, I don't know this dude. I was never even in the area. But it's like, certain things just about this case just didn't necessarily, because initially they tried to get the DNA dropped because Chunk ended up throwing out a theory that turns out to kind of be correct. Basically, because it's like, how did the cops know to go where they went to get Michael's DNA? Because it wasn't in the system, because they tried to run it, but they didn't. But there was a genealogy company that had his DNA because his wife sent it in years ago because Michael didn't really know too much about, his family. He wanted to learn more. So his wife thought it would be a nice gift for him. And that's how the cops found it, because basically they submitted his DNA, Mike Harper's DNA again, and it led to it's like, oh, there's a duplicate. Hence how they were able to find out that, Miss Harper knew, that's how they all tied it together. So they used kind of subterfuge to kind of figure it out, which they tried to use that to suppress the DNA, but the judge was kind of like, that's more so in the genealogy company side of things. You kind of should take fault with them. But more so than anything, it's like a little boy, it was about his dad now who grew up in a foster system, most likely stayed there till he's 18. So someone has to take responsibility for that, so the DNA couldn't be suppressed, because the DNA was a linchpin to the ADA's entire case. But at the same time, even with that being said, they picked jurors who basically went more with their gut. They wanted jurors who would be a little more, who kind of look things in from a pessimistic point of view, so that they could find, put themselves a little more in Michael's shoe of oh man, these turn of events could happen. And they're more likely to side with Michael because they might think oh, what if I was in that type of situation from a pessimistic point of view. So there's that. But the ADA was smiling, and that bothered Bull, because it's like, why are you smiling? Because you're acting like this is such a still sure thing. Because with the DNA, there's still, all they need is at least one juror not to agree, and this whole thing turns into a mistrial. So there's that thing. But it turns out Harper had an oxy addiction because he broke his ankle. He started taking pills. He never prescribed himself the pills. He always went to other doctors, so there were always legal prescriptions and stuff like that. His wife found out about his addiction, and he kicked it himself. So his wife was the only one who knew about it. Couldn't put her on the stand because she would have been forced to tell the truth about that. Turns out one of the doctors he went to was his neighbor. And you could tell his neighbor was trying not to, burn him in that regard. But he really didn't have much choice. He was on their oath and everything. So basically they set it up so it's like, hey, obviously he has forced it to go okay, he went to, even you recognize that he potentially had an addiction, hence why you stopped prescribing him medication. Even if in the beginning you thought oh, he was in great pain there, but hey, now you're okay, because typical with this situation is with people who get cooked on oxy, once they get cut off, they tend to turn to heroin. That ends up being how the trajectory typically goes, which that's a kind of because it's every person's different, but I guess it's because it's such a generalization, you kind of have to go with it. I guess it happens probably every 4 out of 5 times. That's typically how things play out. I'm assuming that's kind of what the statistic would kind of be for them to kind of use it in such broad terms like that, such a generalization, because, different people are different things, but it kind of sets it Dr. Harper in a bad light. So there's that. Then on top of not only the DNA evidence, there's also the fact is that Sam pointed and said that was the guy who killed his dad. And I was okay. At that moment, that's when it clicked in my head. I was even before everything, I was it's got to be a twin situation there. Because I did like Danny's initial theory about maybe it's DNA transference is basically DNA secondhand. Basically some Harper's DNA went to the killer, and the killer transferred that to, Joseph. So that was kind of initial theory at first. I was okay, that's pretty interesting. I really like they immediately set Taylor up. They're continuing certain aspects that we kind of learned about her last episode. Like, for example, Danny happens to walk into the office and hears music blasting. It's like, okay, Taylor's doing her thing. And it's like, oh, how did you get this? They just gave this to you? It's like, Taylor's like, well, I kind of cheated. I'm just like, okay, I guess that's something we could expect from the future. Because I love that's her way of kind of going about it too, when she kind of goes about things kind of a sideways. She's like, actually, I kind of cheated. She did that a lot last episode. But it's just kind of like, yeah, I probably forgot to mention that I was no longer working with Homeland Security when I asked them for this camera footage. And she's like, then it's like, yeah, I need you in my boat, baby. And it's like, Taylor already making herself home as part of the team. I think it's pretty nice. Obviously this is technically our second case with her, but first official case with her as a part of TAC. I mean, to be fair, maybe not. The way Chunk was talking to her about, like, oh yeah, all of our clients are kind of like this, but hey, maybe there's some stuff in between episodes. Who knows? In that case, and what I meant in that regard is, like, maybe they had cases that, we're not seeing, but this is just one of the cases that she's partaken upon in her early days working with TAC. Nevertheless, because there was someone they caught on footage and stuff grabbing his arm because they were falling down the stairs. So it's like at that point, oh, DNA transfer. Lady's taking a photo, and Taylor's like, oh, but it's probably hard, like, tracking down who that person is and getting their IP address and being able to get that photo. But sadly, it turns out later on, because Danny was like, it's hard, not impossible, and Taylor kind of ends up doing it later on, but they end up finding out, because Harper was kind of hoping for this, but he's like, if they had asked him, he would have told him the person on the stairs was a lady, so it turned out not to be that, and, so. But, I think, luckily, Marissa has her particular situation that kind of got her looking into this, because the fact is that Harper's mom was super reluctant about talking about the past and stuff like that, because ultimately this all came down to, like, Bull was like, okay, we have to make a deal, because if we don't do this, the jury's going to convict him. With everything that's been set up, no one's going to side with Michael on this. Like, everything is, like, pointing towards him in his direction, so it's like, it doesn't look good. So they kind of have no choice but to take the deal. Bull got it down to 15. Just because of that. Because I was thinking, like, shouldn't we look at the fact is that, Sam was kind of a kid. I was like, maybe he, because I thought that, that was kind of another thought that kind of crossed my mind earlier on before even the twin thing was kind of like, oh yeah, like, maybe Sam just misidentified. He's a kid, so, heat of the moment, maybe he saw someone else's face or something like that. It turned out not to be the case. That ended up not being the case. He clearly saw Michael's face, and obviously we learned why later on. But nevertheless, but Marissa having her own situation about being adopted, like, understanding, like, why his parents were reluctant to talk about the past and stuff like that, made you go, okay, so, because Michael was so sure he was, it's like, turns out he was adopted and he had no idea, and then he finds out about his twin brother. So, that ended up being the linchpin that ended up destroying the entire case. That's why, because I thought his mom had a reluctancy to talk about the past because she had given up his twin brother. I thought that was the whole deal. It's like, no, like, she didn't want to talk about it because she didn't want to admit that he was adopted. That was just a conversation she just never had with him, I guess, or never wanted to have. It's like, you're my baby. I don't want you to think you're anyone else's. So there's that. So it's kind of sad because it turns out, like, oh, everything points towards his brother. Like, his brother had a connection with the dude. He had trouble with heroin. He had a violent streak. So even the ADA at the end of it all was kind of like, okay, let's take some time away, confer with the other side, and we'll, try and find out the truth behind the situation. So all charges against Dr. Harper were ultimately dropped. But it does kind of make him feel a little sad in the situation, in the sense of, like, hey, here's a brother I had no idea about. Yeah, he did a terrible thing and he was a drug dealer and stuff like that. But for him, it's like, when he looked at his brother's life, it's like, we had so much in common. We played basketball. We did the same thing. The fact is, we used to get in fights, and, like, he got in fights. I got in fights. And for him, it's like, at what point were their lives so differently? But at the same time, he's like, yeah, but I have family that made sure I went to school, and I have a beautiful wife that ended up helping me fight an addiction. That was the other thing. Like, they both have an addiction issue. But Bull also talks about free will in a sense too, because, like, our DNA doesn't determine everything about us. We have the free will to decide what choices we make in life. You know, the piece by piece, we can determine how our life goes out in our choices, and the choices that the doctor made led him to the path that he's on, that ended up leading him to get the help he needed for his addiction, making sure that he stayed on his good path, being married to this amazing woman, having amazing kids. And, you know, so I thought that was kind of a pretty nice, like, into the case. I love the ending of it being like, you know, I think the whole thing, like the lawyer and Benny were kind of like, you know what, we're going to go check in on our siblings. I think the situation kind of brought that to their mind of like Benny in particular talking about, well, his brother and sister. Has his brother come up in conversation before? Because I was like, oh, your sister. It didn't literally click in my head until like right now when I was sitting here. I was like, right, Isabella. I forgot. I completely forgot. It's like, yeah, that's your sister. I completely let that slip my mind to just now. I was like, oh, brother and sister. And then the moment the word sister came out of my mouth, then I remembered that. It's like, right. But I don't know if his brother's ever come up in conversation before. Maybe. And then I was like, oh, boy, what are you going to do? He's like, I'm going to look up an ex-girlfriend. So, because he saw Isabella, saw like a little like Facebook message or whatever saying like she was happy. I mean, not necessarily Facebook. It looked like Facebook, but, you know, probably without going, you know. So that's interesting. I mean, we don't know which ex-girlfriend, but it is that situation of like, oh, you know, Isabella told him like, hey, you don't do well alone. You need somebody in your corner by your side. So I guess that was him kind of like, hey, I'm gonna try, you know, she's happy, you know, and even hiding the fact is because the moment he was looking at that and Marissa came in at the beginning of it, so he closed the laptop super fast. Doesn't want anyone to know that he's kind of like doing that because, you know, now, you know, I'm sure he's going to be working towards his happiness. I'm curious if that's going to be something we see in the next episode or not, but at the very least, it's the thought process of like, hey, you know, he himself is taking his own advice of like, our destiny is kind of ours to make. So if I want to be happy, I might, you know, might as well, you know, see where things are. I'm curious what ex he's referring to, because he's even had exes when it comes to the show. Like Diana, for example, like we never cut back to that at all. We don't know where they really stand, but maybe they just broke up and we just never got that side of things. Or maybe he's talking about a girlfriend that we have no idea or know nothing about. Like I said, we've met a few over the course of the show, some before the show, in a sense of like they happen like outside of the show, and others that have happened in the show. So there's that whole thing. So, like I said, overall, a very interesting episode. Almost had kind of like a soap opera twist to it with the whole brother situation. But, really, that's all I wanted to talk about in this episode. Till next time, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.